Namaste and good evening, everyone. Namaste, Sraddhalu.
Namaste. Happy to be with all of you.
We are happy to continue today the sixth installment of how we can carry our current growth of consciousness in our next life. You may post your questions in the chat box during this conversation, or you may send beforehand your questions at our email ID, integralstudies.in@gmail.com. And we receive a quite long letter from Sandhya, so we'll go with question number 1. You talked about conscious pregnancy in this week's talk. I wanted to ask, will surrogacy interfere with the soul's choice or have any impact on the whole process? I ask this question as many well-known women are choosing to have babies through this method, which may soon become mainstream.
It's an important question and somewhat new in our human experience that something like this is taking place with the intervention of a medical selection of the cells used to build the fetus. This is somewhat new. Variations of this have existed in the past, where you adopted somebody else's child. Or sometimes even in certain societies, it was acceptable that if one of the family members was infertile, that the impregnation would take place with some relative. So if the husband was infertile, then the brother of the husband might impregnate or some such variation. But the idea still is that somebody else conceives, gives birth to your child. This has now been taken to a dramatic extreme, where in the test tube laboratory setting, you take the cell from the mother, cell from the father, start the process of cellular division of the fetus up to a certain point, and then implant that forming fetus back into the womb of the mother. That would be one which is called test tube babies, not very different from the biological process, except this part of the conception has taken place outside. But in surrogacy, this is now implanted in a third person, another woman who receives now what biologically is the child of these two parents, now implanted into her. Neither the sperm nor the ovum is hers or her family. The ovum is not hers. But in any case, the biology itself might accept or reject. There's that complexity. But to her, the entire pregnancy is her pregnancy, even though the genetics belongs to the other couple. In such a case, more likely than not, and I'm going purely by the rationality of it and the nature of the experience, when the soul chooses, if the surrogate mother is not in the environment of the real parents, then it will be attracted to the nature of that mother and her environment. If the surrogate mother is part of the family held within that space, then it is possible that the soul would still be attracted to the overall vibrational quality of that space. So a lot would depend on how that surrogacy is actually implemented. From what I understand, in most cases, the surrogate mother does not have the same degree of participation of the atmosphere in which the parents live. And so very likely what would be attracted by the soul, what would be attractive to the soul, might not remain at the point of the separation. Also, in the nature of the surrogacy, the contract requires, in most cases, that the actual biological mother who gave birth, though not genetically the mother, would have no further contact. She gives birth, she goes away, she is just like a machine that produced the baby, provided a womb for on hire, and goes away and does not interfere. In certain cases, there are, I understand, some women who do this as a routine, as part of their way of earning money by becoming pregnant repeatedly for such purpose. Now, in case of the child, irrespective of whether it was in the original environment or separate from the environment. In the case of the child, the soul, and the experience of bonding that is inherent to the nature of incarnation, the bonding with the mother, there will be a rupture. There will be a pain of separation. There will be a deep sense of loss of that separation whenever that takes place, which can then be perhaps corrected by the genetic mother, but not the biological mother taking place. But again, in the nature of that experience, since the material came from the genetics of the couple, but they did not experience the pregnancy, they did not experience the hormonal flows and the highs and the intensity of the bonding experience, etc. It would not have any of that beneficial quality that nature has intended in that initial bonding process and for the purpose of nurturing. I remember meeting once a lady. She was from one of the royal families in North India, and there was some discussion about divine love, mother's love, love for the mother on a spiritual level. But we use the word mother as divine mother. So she said to me, I have never experienced a mother's love, and I don't know what it means. And so for me, when you speak of divine mother, it makes no sense. And I don't even know what to expect or how to relate to. It was one of those things which I can now, looking back, recognize as a failure of that natural, healthy attachment process, which perhaps was because that was the culture in the royal families, or perhaps that particular royal family had that insularity in their upbringing, whatever the cause. In practice, it became such that she was brought up by a hired woman who became the practical, not surrogate in terms of giving birth, but in terms of raising her. Her actual mother being technically in the royal family and queen or whatever it must have been, she hardly had contact there. The other woman was looking after her but didn't have the same bonding and the commitment of love. And the result was she grew up with this complete dryness and incapacity to feel deep emotion, perhaps by the deep neglect of early childhood. And what I understand today is that this is increasingly becoming common because of the nature of modern life. And some of the largely encouraged practices that come from cinema, and I will even go so far as to say the cabal agenda, where they want children to grow up disconnected from the parents, with hostility to their parents. They want families to fragment. There is an entire genre of films created for this purpose to show dysfunctional families. And you can look up, I was quite shocked to see on the Netflix categories, dysfunctional families is a genre in which all the cinema is about families that don't function. Children hate parents, parents are drunk or abusive or not present, or everything is fragmented. There is no bonding, there is no love, there is no healthy, nurturing growth, security, etc., which makes for the child to be damaged. And often that becomes a self-perpetuating track when they have children, etc. And all of this has led to a severe problems of this kind of what is, if you look up, it is worth it today to study this, what is called attachment theory. It came from a observation many decades back when a child was left with a parent, and at some point the parent was asked to leave suddenly and then come back randomly, leave suddenly and come back randomly. They found that children typically took three kinds of response. In the first case, they became anxious. When will she come? What happened? I feel abandoned. And they will start getting into anxiety until the mother came and soothed. And that built an anxious attachment. That became then because it took place at such an early stage in childhood, there's no conscious memory of it. So that became then the habit and the norm in adult life. Another, which is what they call fearful attachment. And a third, which is called avoidant attachment. In the case of the avoidant attachment, it literally, the child shuts down. The mother comes, goes, doesn't matter. Anyway, she'll go at any random time or come or not. She'll never be there for me. And you close yourself emotionally. Because it has happened at such an early age, in the rest of the growth path, you do not experience, you cannot experience. Even biologically, it affects, because the normal sensors and the receptors for the oxytocin and other hormonal releases which come from the natural cuddling relationship of the mother with child and the sense of security, closeness, and compassion that is felt in that contact has not happened. And biologically, there is a deficiency, insufficiency. So there's a lot of research going around this, and it's only somewhat recently that I was exposed to this. And I understand from people who have worked uh, in the space of counseling that the numbers are growing, and it shows a general breakdown in society itself. So I come back to the question, in the case of surrogacy, the soul's choice itself might be confused in the way it unfolds in circumstances later in life because of this sudden separation. It will definitely have an impact on the child's psychological development and the sense of healthy attachment to parents or to relationships, and often long term. And the last part of your question, you're saying many well-known women are choosing to have babies through this method. Typically, these are film stars or people who have been promoted into position of as influencers and who are often under influence of the cabal agenda. And so they're asked to do this, sometimes very superficially. It's because they will say we have to protect our figure, because if we are pregnant, then we will lose our tummy and so on. Not good enough reason, because the human biology actually comes back. If you take care of it, it actually comes back. It's designed to be uh, perfect in the nature's working. But it is part of the cabal agenda to create these dysfunctional and fragmented families. And even when you, Sandhya's question ends with, which may soon become mainstream. This is the idea they want to project to you. They want you to start thinking that this is normal and that this should become mainstream. Should not be so. Do not believe that it will become mainstream, because fortunately human instincts are much more deeply rooted, and one may hope that despite such efforts, the instincts will eventually overwhelm and correct for this. So overall, my response would be that surrogacy will cause more harm than good, and such things should be considered only in very rare cases, and that too where absolutely there's no other choice, and that too when one has to follow up with very close bonding even following the birth. So we go to the next question.
Her second question, a friend of mine who considers himself a spiritual person says we shouldn't interfere in other people's karma. For example, if someone has to suffer financially at some point in their life, we shouldn't help them financially. He believes that if we do, we will bear the consequences of their karmic actions. Intuitively, this doesn't feel right to me. Is there any truth to this?
It actually covered a question very similar recently, a few weeks ago, but your intuition is right. This is not the case. And all these ideas come largely from the Buddhist and the Jain traditions, where nature has been made, mechanical nature, lower nature has been made all in all. The soul's freedom has been forgotten, set aside, ignored. And so there is this machinery. And in the nature of machinery, karma literally becomes mathematical. In the Jain traditions, they actually build a whole mathematics around it. And in the Buddhist tradition, again, it is largely mathematical. You keep having to free yourself from karma with all kinds of methods to remain somewhat free and get it to a point of extreme freedom and all those things. It does not work like that. And we have discussed this in some detail, so I won't repeat that. The point, though, is not every suffering, including financial suffering, is consequence of karma. It can simply be incompetence, missed opportunities because of inertia, or many other things. Why put everything and label it together as karma? Why blame karma for all that happens? This is unfortunately one of those very amateurish, false representations of the idea of karma and even of spiritual teaching. I saw this with some bit of a shock when in Europe, in one of the countries, there was a whole group of people who greatly revered somebody who had come from India. The only thing he had was he knew a few asanas and he could play beautiful music with an instrument. That's all he had. He had zero knowledge of spirituality, but he had built himself as a teacher. And his disciples kept saying this. Oh, he keeps saying, everything is karma, everything is karma, everything is karma. And they literally programmed themselves to believe that. And I said, what a damaging teaching it becomes from this kind of false and wrong knowledge. Not everything is karma. You can, of course, expand the definition of karma to say, well, it's consequence of your actions or inactions, etc. In that case, yes, you could say, so you had financial difficulties because you were incompetent. So it's a consequence of your incompetence, so it is karma. No, but that's not what you mean when you say karma. You have to suffer because in some past life, you did something wrong to someone and it's now coming back. These are two very different things. So do not confuse the two. And interfering again in someone's karma means the idea is you're going to sit back and allow somebody else to suffer. And when you suffer, you are supposed to be abandoned by everyone else so that your suffering may be only yours, is very stupid and immature as an idea. We, even in the karmic level, there are all kinds of blendings of influences, individual, collective, small collectivities. You are married to somebody, there's a sharing of karma. You're part of a family, there's a sharing in the family karma. You're part of a community, and to the extent you're involved and bound in the community consciousness, you're part of the sharing of the community karma. And through all the levels of any degree of attachment and involvement. So, where do you draw the line to say it is your karma, isn't it? The thing itself is wrong conceptually. Uh, Still, having said that, suppose for some reason even a person is going through a difficulty which has some karmic basis, and only as a basis, it's never really entirely that. By helping them, it's not as if you take on the karma on yourself. That idea itself is wrong. And it comes from these traditions where soul and God do not exist. So everything is mathematical. So if you enter into that, the karma is, let's say, divided and shared between two of you. And so you're going to suffer, you're going to get bad luck. No, it's not like that. The truth to this is simply this, that if somebody is in a, let's say, depressed condition, when you engage with the person to try to help them, you tend to be pulled into their depressive tendency. So to that extent, there is an infectious influence. If the person is carrying what people would call bad luck, and you engage with them too much, you fear that you might catch the bad luck. Well, something like that can happen purely in this sense, that you get pulled into their negative energies. And to that extent, when you come back, you're still carrying some of their negative energy. But it's not the same thing as saying you've taken their karma. There can be such a thing as taking karma, which does happen, can be done. It can be done consciously, sometimes it can happen unconsciously, but that happens when you feel yourself in a state of a bonding where you want to help by sharing in their struggle. To the extent you participate, let's say you're seeing this person financially in difficulty, you say, all right, I'm going to help you. You get involved. You get involved in their business. You get involved in their processes. Take on upon yourself responsibilities to those things. Yes, then you're obviously sharing in the difficulties involved, and to that extent, we could call it karma. But it's not as if the person has bad luck that it gets transferred onto you. Rather, let's put it that way. Suppose you believe that bad karma can be transferred. Why not good karma? So if you come with a lot of positive energy, and this person who's, let's say, semi-depressed, and share your positive energy and literally dissolve their depression, you are not getting their depression, but they are getting your positivity. So in the nature of emotions, energies, affection, love, it's not mathematical. Because these are states of consciousness, and the person may be in a lower grade of consciousness. Your higher influence can lift them, turn them into a higher grade of consciousness. Nothing is lost. More is gained. It's like a candle lighting another candle. The flame grows, the state is changed. The consciousness may be of the same substance, but the state has been changed. So this would be much more useful as a way of thinking, that if I were to engage with somebody who is in severe depression and I'm afraid that I might catch their depression, then you already have a tendency for the depression, which he might be triggering. On the other hand, if you're so full of positivity and optimism that you can overwhelm and dissolve their thing, you should do that to the extent that you feel interested, involved, or responsible. And it has nothing to do with karma. So I hope with this we understand why that thinking could feel correct to somebody in their experience, because it's not to do with karma, but it has to do with transmission and sharing of states of consciousness. But also you can understand why you should, where necessary, where you have responsibility, involve yourself, engage yourself, and bring something positive. If all was mathematical karma, the entire world would be one gigantic, painful machine of suffering, which is the Buddhist concept, in some traditions at least. On the other hand, all is expression of Satchidananda and divine consciousness and delight. And so to express that, to find that, to recover that should be much easier than to remain stuck in suffering. And any effort you make, when you make that small effort from below, you will receive also the help from above. So again, if you go back to mathematics, you make 10% effort and you get 90% added support from above to get a 100% result. And karma in mathematical terms is completely shattered, becomes meaningless and pointless. My general advice for those at least who have a spiritual perspective and aspiration and practice in life is stop worrying about karma. Rather engage with what feels at that point the right thing to do. Make an effort to consciously serve the divine will. The divine will can use karma, can transcend karma, modify, dissolve, change anything, even if there is karma issues. And karma would be a very small part of overall issues. The divine will, the divine influence can lift you out of your incompetence and awaken in your capacity and competence. Nothing to do with karma. And your problems will be solved. Or the other person's problems will be solved if that infusion of competence could be awakened in them, and so on. So there are many, many things beyond the very narrow patch that karma has to play. And all these are much more powerful, much more useful, and much more relevant for those who are aspiring for a spiritual and particularly an affirmative spiritual life. You can go to the third question.
Recently, I have been reading a lot of literature about near-death experiences, including OB, and most accounts describe experiencing a kind review of the entire life up to that point. Can you please shed some light on this?
Yes. This is also something we've spoken of, I think, somewhat recently. What we find in cases of near-death experience, at the moment when an accident is about to happen, there is a head-on collision, let's say, two vehicles. The person describes as if suddenly pulled into a different state of awareness, in which the soul's perspective has been pulled into that consciousness. The soul's perspective looks back at the entire journey of this life. In a single fraction of a moment, every tiny detail of the life is seen. And in that moment, which is of so many years, every tiny detail momentarily, instantly is seen, known, experienced, held in that identity, vision of identity. That's the nature of the soul's experience. A decision is made, is my work finished or not finished? And in this case, in most cases, the decision is, though there's something still left to be done. And poof, you fall back into your normal consciousness. The collision, which was as if frozen in that moment, now takes place. There's the shock, there's the damage. Maybe even your body was damaged, and you survive with the memory, hopefully. And of course, having had that memory, having had that momentary touch of the soul's consciousness and its glimpse of how it can be in time and still be eternal, and it's such an extraordinary experience, you are changed fundamentally. Something similar can take place also in certain kinds of outer body experience. If you're able to enter some of the higher realms, then you can experience those things consciously. But still, now my point is, here you were given this as if in the moment of the shock. If you were sufficiently evolved and awake and conscious and receptive, the memory is retained. In many cases, although this thing took place, the choice was made, and they are thrown back into the body, the memory is lost or some vague imprint remains. Still, it is enough to change a person. So most cases you will see after a near-death experience, there's a radical shift in personality. They become much more compassionate, more universal, more free, more wide. And the spiritual side suddenly opens up. And all this shows you that these things belonged to the inner consciousness and the inner being. They were covered by this hard crust of outer shell of personality. And it is sad to see how much of humanity, and again increasingly, is held in this hard crust. Very few are able to break free, break through, sometimes slowly, sometimes radically, but very few are able to break free sufficiently that the soul's values and the soul's influence can come forward, dominate, and lead the life. If that can happen, when that can happen, the entire sense of the life journey changes completely. Also, the experience after leaving the body changes completely. So when we go back to Sri Aurobindo's text today, we'll also look at, if we have the time, we will look at one of the letters of Sri Aurobindo where he discusses this. But, or maybe that might come next time. But he explains how a lot depends on whether the psychic influence is prominently at the front. If it is at the front at the time of death, then you can very quickly pass through the transitional realms, let's say vital mental worlds, and go straight into the state of rest in the trance of the psychic assimilative process. You don't need to go through all those layers being slowly shed and the worlds corresponding to them and so on. If that psychic presence and influence is strongly at the front. And of course, if it is in the front during much of the life, your entire life is of a different grade. Because the values by which you live are not superficial values, they are soul values. And when you meet people like that, it is such a joy, it is such a deep satisfaction to see they live by something deeper, something real. And yes, sometimes superficial things come and pass. It doesn't matter. You don't bind to them. You don't build yourself. You don't define your life. You don't take life decisions based on those superficial values. So that's the shift that takes place when there is a near-death experience and something of this momentary surging forward of the inner being, taking charge, making a decision, and then, so to say, retreating, is enough to leave an imprint on the surface as if to make a dramatic shift, cut, break, dissolution, or throwing off of the hard crust of the cover, that the personality now is more truly what they should have always been and what they actually are within. So I think this is a comprehensive enough discussion about what that is. In any case, this capacity for the soul to see as if time is frozen and yet you see the totality of time is something very special. And it is in appreciation of this that we can understand also how the soul can conceive of, perceive the future, even form the future while being in the present and so on. If that comes up in another question, we'll take that also. We go to the next question.
The fourth question, people link illnesses, for example, cancer, of great yogis like Raman Maharishi and Ramakrishna Parahamsa as a result of taking on the karmic burdens of their disciples. Could you please explain this?
Yes, in both these cases, it seems as if both these personalities spoke of that. Ramakrishna Paramahamsa actually said that the suffering that his body was going through was the result of the karma that he had taken upon himself of his disciples. Ramana Maharshi similarly made a comment in this direction when he had the cancer and things like that. Meaning also that if they chose to, they could have even willed the cure if suppose it had come for other reasons. But in this case, because they had taken on a certain karma, and so with it a certain form in which the karma worked out in the biology, they used it as a means to assist, to help others. Now, elaborating on this, I can give, I'll explain this in a certain way. From the perspective of a guru, which is very different from a teacher, or in Sanskrit we have many different distinctions. Acharya is one who shows the good behavior, the moral standard, the ethical standard by example. So he's an acharya. There is a shikshak, one who gives lessons, who teaches you, but it doesn't have to be himself capable and living by those values. So shikshak, acharya, and then there's one more term, I forget, where the person has actually some knowledge. And then guru is the fourth, which is the higher grade, where literally the person has the ability to remove your darkness, ignorance, or infuse light and imprint into you an experience. That's when technically you would call guru. Now, of course, the words are all misused today in many different ways. I'm just going back to technicality to make this distinction. Now, there are very few, let's use the English word teacher, and I would put a capital T in such case to highlight that it's not a normal sense of teacher. There are very few such teachers who have the ability to either infuse directly an experience or even intervene in the consciousness of a student or disciple to change something, to remove as if a clouding influence darkness, and thus help. First of all, there are very few such. Having had that, among them there would be some, perhaps, or very few who would be capable of, even taking upon themselves, as if by joining with the student or disciple in a part of the consciousness, taking upon themselves a certain burden of their difficulties. Now, it has a certain value. Let me give a more material example, which will relate to the earlier questions also with surrogacy. Normally, you see, when a child is soon after birth, the mother experiences the body of the child as if her own body and a part of her own body now separated. So it has a very deep sense of identification, even on a physical level. Not only the biology, there's a subtle physical link. And then there is the vital and the mental substance also, which are in continuity, which are the umbilical in a sense. The biological umbilical cut, the psychological umbilicals are present. In that, she feels by identity what the child feels. In that, she transmits in that identity a support and nourishment to the child. In that, the child feels closeness of its mother and even draws nourishment from the mother through that subtle physical, let's say, subtle umbilical. And in the part in which there is still the strong identity, it is also a protective influence, it is a nourishing influence, it is also an influence of understanding, caring, love, affection, bonding, etc. Now, if that is prematurely cut, you can see what the problems would be. But if this is reasonably healthy and gradually thins out, you have constantly throughout the child's growth repeatedly this experience that the mother feels the child's distress, suffering, problem, and even as if absorbs it into herself. Or the child feeling some difficulty leans back to draw upon the mother's substance as a protection or as a nourishment to handle that difficulty. So let's say now, practical example, the child has a fever. What's the simplest way? You boost the vitality, vital energy, and the body will of its own take care of it. There's an infection of some kind. All those are superficial symptoms. It's finally energies which are in disharmony. You increase the internal innate vital energy sufficiently that it can either set right the disharmony or push out the disharmony. Very simple. At that point, the mother, being an adult, has far greater vitality than the child. So the child naturally clings in illness, in suffering, in distress, clings and hugs the mother. And at that moment opens itself, and the mother, hugging the child, pours herself into him energetically. Even there is the experience where she takes the child's fever into herself. Within a few minutes, the child is free of the fever and the mother has the fever, but her body can digest and dissolve it within 10, 20 minutes, an hour at most. And the child is free. Now, here's a good example of how you can take upon yourself somebody else's difficulty and resolve it. The child freed from it. Now, if the thing is done on other psychological tendencies, you can even dissolve major problems. If the person does not then do the follow-up now to catch this new state of freshness, health, good health, and starts missing the fever. Hey, I was getting much more attention when I was sick. I long to go back to the sickness to get that attention. Then the child chooses to slide back into sickness and even repeat the cycle of sickness. I've seen a few cases like that. Every time that they did some cure, initially everything was fine, and then within a few days, the things would reverse because the child wanted to be sick. I give an example of such a case where it was many years down, and when somehow I had occasion to interact with that person, and I made him aware of it. I said, "Do you realize this is what you're doing? This is how it's happening?" And he was smart enough, very smart, in fact, and he became quiet for a while, and then he laughed. He said, "Yes, I know. I want it. I want it to happen because that's how I get that attention." And I said, "You will have to make the choice that you want to get well, and nobody else can help you because you are calling it back." But he did at some point. I think he did get free of it. That's not the point. The tendency, then, if you do not catch the new state and want to stay in it, the tendency to want to go back, there you can do nothing. Even the mother cannot keep taking. She can, if the child is small enough, she can still infuse her positive tendency and shape his personality to some extent. But otherwise, there's not much you can do. And so, coming to now at an adult stage, a guru, again, I'm using the word very specifically, a teacher who has that capacity and competence and the willingness to do, which he may not do for all disciples or students, can intervene in such ways and take some part of their difficulty, distress upon themselves as a way of freeing the person to help them make a certain breakthrough, while, of course, infusing the necessary help for the breakthrough. Literally, you have the sense of holding the person in your consciousness. I give the example of the mother. This was narrated to me by Gautam Chawla, who was her helper, very close to her for certain types of activities. So, sitting in the playground, he would be next to her, and sometimes she would give him assignments for her personal things. And she began to furiously scratch her arm. And he asked, "What is it? What can I do? Can I get you some lotion?" She said, "No, it's nothing to do with that. There's a certain person in the ashram who's indulging in a certain act, which is, and it's reflecting in my body." Now, the reflection in the physical body is only the tail end of the reflection in her subtle body. Because in her consciousness, she had extended herself to include every single person in the ashram community at a psychophysical level, at a spiritual level, taking upon herself the burden of their consciousness. And it's a two-way thing. She's taking the most difficult parts in order for them to be dissolved and infusing the positive light force consciousness in them. During this, of course, to the extent that the disciples were open, they got more benefit. To the extent they were closed, there was a lesser benefit. But she did that. During that, the enormous acceleration of the sadhana in each person was the consequence. Much later, when the families came with children and all that, and the whole intensity of the focus of the sadhana had to be dissolved to make it, or was dissolved because of the mix, either way. At that point, she said she could not do that anymore because there were too many people and it was too mixed. So she said she kept a general pressure and support for everybody. You had to make the effort to open and to receive that help, and the same effort, the same support would be given to you. But this is to explain how a genuine guru can actually engage and take upon themselves something. Now, this can happen primarily for a spiritual purpose. Occasionally, out of intense compassion, they take upon themselves even other things. And I've had occasions to see this in the way my teacher, MP Pandit, used to deal with people. And I've seen actual cases where he helped people in such a way. Not common, not often, but when the point is he could do when it was needed. And sometimes moved by compassion, he did things to help people occasionally in this way also, including sometimes in a almost a material level of intervention. I give an example. This is an interesting case. It may not be of this kind exactly, but it's one of those dramatic examples. There was a person who he was in Delhi, and he used to call every day for whatever reason. And he was a businessman. So it's sometimes nothing. It was just a way of connecting to the presence and receiving the help. And my teacher accepted, which is not something he would do with everyone. And so he had told him, oh, he had a problem, physical illness. There was a boil. And so my teacher said, yes, but it should get well. Again, second day, again it was there. And the third day, when he said, it has not yet gone, my teacher, with some force, he said, how it should go now. There's no reason for it to stay. Some words to that effect, but with force, he said, with a vehemence of force. And he said, by the end of the day, it had just vanished like that, suddenly, no trace of it left. Now, so in this case, it's a force put out for a certain result. But also on some other level, he is holding the person or feeling the person within his consciousness. And to whatever extent, there are degrees to which this can be done. So yes, as a consequence, certain elements which could be of a tendency which is karmic would also be taken if so chosen, etc. Sometimes not intentionally, sometimes as a consequence of something else being removed. So the word karma is not a very helpful term because of all the confusions which are associated with it. Technically, in Sanskrit, the prarabdha is the word, that which was begun before. Tendencies from the past, tendencies of prior habits. So in that sense, prarabdha is a better term. Begun before, literal translation. Pra-arabdha. Arabdha is begun. So a tendency continuing, one can dissolve, modify, remove, take upon oneself, etc. Many possibilities. But why would you do that? Only if there's a specific reason. And so I said, I'm coming to the most dramatic case. When my teacher decided to leave the body, there was a period of about 6 months in which the decision was made perhaps even 9 months before. But in those 6 months particularly, there was something which was dramatically and rapidly happening. So even biological discomfort of illnesses began to ramp up. And I believe we did see that there was a way that could have been resolved, but it's as if the soul used that as an excuse to shut down the biology, which was very strong, very healthy. And so withdrawing from it was not easy. It required a time to gradually withdraw and break down. And so while all this was happening, in the last stage, interestingly, in the 1 month before, it's as if the breakdown had begun. And there's something he did, as if he looked at each person and looked at their future and said something. So to my mother, he said something. To his sister, to me, about me, he said something. So what will happen to you after I go? Literally, that was the thinking. Oh, this will happen. Oh, in your case, this will happen. Oh, in your case, this will. He was putting everything in place. And in that last 1 month, literally, he did something which I saw in the results was a large number of people experienced a dramatic shift of dissolution of their problems. It's as if he had taken upon himself the burden of whatever it was. But since the decision was made for the body to be shed, taking all that made sense because taking upon his own body's decline and harm was a way of helping others. Would not have been done at a stage when the body needed to be healthy for the purpose of the work. But now, since the decision is made and there's going to be a breakdown, it made sense to do something like this. So I'm taking this as an example to relate to the specific question of the illnesses of Ramakrishna Paramahansa or Ramana Maharshi. Once the decision made to withdraw from the body, it was then that things were taken at a material level, which even became seemingly the superficial excuse. And as a way of helping those who were connected, close, or those towards whom they felt that compassion. And we saw it was quite dramatic. At least a dozen people that we personally heard, as if overnight certain sticky problems, illnesses, difficulties, just like that dissolved. And it was just before he left his body. Interesting. So I suppose this is a longish explanation, but gives you an understanding of this. It's not directly related to our topic, but indirectly, because the whole business of the karma and experiences and transition across lives, it deals with these things, and particularly the nature of how karma sticks to you into the next life is understood when you look at things like this. I think we have less time, so we should move to the topic of the text itself. So last time you will remember, we have been studying chapter 22, rebirths and other worlds, karma, the soul, and immortality. That's the title of the chapter. Here we saw how Sri Aurobindo explains the whole mechanism of what happens when the body is shed, and logically, the nature of the transition. So we saw that in certain very low developed grades of consciousness, there might even be an almost immediate incarnation, reincarnation. In the more developed, more conscious, more vital, mental, individualized, there would be a continuity in other worlds, in other states, and for which there's a second objective, which is, so the first is because automatically when the biology is shed, you are pulled into alignment to those worlds. And so you are there, you are in them. But the second reason is the need for the soul to assimilate, prepare for the work to be done in the next life, and then to put forward the necessary ingredients, elements for not only forming the next personality, but also the experiences of the life. So all this we saw, and then we came to this question. We stopped halfway in the text of a paragraph where he takes up the typical religious ideas, where people say, oh, you have to incarnate immediately, or others say, no, you have to suffer consequences of your karmas in hells or heavens. So there are, of course, religions where there is no further life, but you still have to go through hells and heavens, or you're stuck in them permanently. In some, they will say you'll pass through them and then get to the heavens. In others, you'll go through your hells and heavens depending on your karmas, and then you will reincarnate. So there are many variations. And he's looking at all this. Instead of just saying, oh, this is all nonsense, this is what it is. He says, look, why is this happening? Why is this theory there? Why is this idea? Obviously, there may be some basis to somebody's experience, perhaps, or even to somebody's fantasy. But what's the rationale of it? And he tries to give you a comprehensive picture where you understand why someone would focus on this and someone else would focus on that. And then he shows you this continuity. Now, the interesting thing is, all of this is related to the spiritual evolution. You remove spiritual evolution and all this becomes meaningless. You bring back spiritual evolution and then you understand how these are processes which are either consequences of spiritual evolution or necessary for the spiritual evolution. So, in the portion where we paused, we saw that if there is a complexity of the experience, so even in, I gave the example of the dogs having a complex mental experience, then the need for the assimilation becomes absolutely necessary. And so a period of rest and so on. So I come to the text. So when the soul is not very evolved, he says, there is very little compulsion to have that kind of a rest. And a tendency is almost, a tendency for rapid rebirth is almost inevitable. The other point he made, at the point where you have made the transition, you have many parts, you have a very complex interaction of different substances. Each is pulled to its grade, to its worlds, to its tendencies. And I said last time, it's almost as if there's an average of all this which determines where you tend to drift. But also a lot depends on the moment of death, where if you make a conscious effort to highlight a particular aspect, your higher, deeper, then that is the direction you naturally more rapidly move towards. There's one more point which I did not mention last time. If there has not been sufficient individualization, then these disparate, complex blend of parts would also fragment and as if fall apart and drift apart. Interesting. And so if this is what happens in very early stages of evolution, and often in certain kinds of animal incarnations, where the individuality is not strongly formed, the parts separate, so to say, drift off into their respective realms, worlds, gradations of consciousness, and they might combine with other fragmentary parts of others and form new structures, which could become focal points for further individualization of a new kind or not. The soul spark, not yet individualized, might simply withdraw, move on with nothing of this remaining. Or if it is sufficiently individualized and formed, it would carry more of this content and substance with it. So all this relates to early stages where, and this is the reason why in many traditions you have, even in India, we have a particular text which says after death, it describes how this part of your consciousness goes in and merges with the sky and the clouds. That other part goes and merges with the trees and plants. This other part merges with the earth, and so on, suggesting that these different gradations, as they fragment and dissolve, merge into their respective gradations of vibrations. So now we come back to the text. He says that throughout in all the religious beliefs, you have a lot of inconsistency about these things, different theories of immediate transmigration, some with weight into hells and heavens, etc. But he says, he lists all of these. He says, but in the ordinary notion of reincarnation, the idea of a spiritual evolution is not explicit. It is only implied in the fact that the soul has to reach the point at which it becomes capable of transcending the necessity of rebirth and returning to its eternal source. So that's where you have the idea of spiritual evolution. So you'll have these very fanciful statements of people, oh, this is my last birth, I won't come back, I'm fed up with life. Stupid talk, meaningless talk. The soul's choice is very different. But the idea that, oh, you have to somehow reach a point where you can make a choice to not come back, that's the only idea of spiritual evolution. That's not spiritual evolution. So he says, but there is no gradual and graded evolution. This point can be as well reached by a chaotic zigzag movement of which the law is not easily determinable. So somehow one day suddenly, poof, oh, now I've got to that point, I don't need to come back. There's no rationale of what is this gradation or degree of development. You see, this is the problem of the popular understanding of these ideas. And Sri Aurobindo is now, you see, by going into each of these, he highlights what's missing and what's relevant and brings together really to what he's going to say finally. The definitive solution of the question depends on psychic inquiry and experience. Here, we can only consider whether there is, in the nature of things or in the logic of the evolutionary process, any apparent or inherent necessity for either movement, either this for the immediate transition from body to body or for the retardation or interval before a new reincarnation of the self-embodying psychic principle. So now here he's describing this psychic principle which is choosing to embody itself and whether there's a rationale. So I'm going to skip portions of the next paragraph because I want to get to something much more important in the sequence, but just summarizing key points here. The necessity for life in other worlds. Let me just read. A sort of half necessity for the life in other worlds, a dynamic and practical rather than essential necessity, arises from the very fact that the different world principles are interwoven with each other and in a way interdependent, and the effect that this fact must have upon the process of our spiritual evolution. So spiritual evolution itself is deeply impacted by the fact that everything is interwoven and interdependent. The point of interdependence means the lower depends on the higher primarily, but the higher also is affected by the lower. And so there is an interdependence. It's not a one-way dependence. But this might be counteracted for a time by the greater pull or attraction of the earth or the preponderant physicality of the evolving nature. So if in the soul's choice, there is this, oh, I really want to, this is where I want to be. The earth is the most fascinating things to incarnate upon. A choice made for this kind of a special focus, it would have consequences. Or strong pull. In the biology into which you have reincarnated, there's a strong pull down, binding as if anchoring you. Our beliefs in the birth of an ascending soul into the human form and its repeated rebirth in that form, without which it cannot complete its human evolution, rests from the point of view of the reasoning intelligence on the basis that the progressive transit of the soul into higher and higher grades of the earthly existence, and once it has reached the human level, its repeated human birth compose a sequence necessary for the growth of the nature. So, in some, there has to be a sequence corresponding to gradations of consciousness. And there you get a first glimpse of what the spiritual evolution could be like. But it's only a first entry into this. So again, because it's a complex sentence, there are many other ideas that there is a phase which is the animal phase. And then out of that, the human births. Having reached the human level, from there are certain differences between this and that domain. I remember one very highly respected spiritual teacher and somebody that I respected also. He would say, and because he had also a Christian background, he would say that animals don't have souls. And it was a bit of a problem because that's not our experience. You see the individuality and the animals. And when you challenged him with it, he would say, yeah, but that's not soul. That's just individuality and its habitual formation. It's a habit, it's not soul. And his point was, I don't see it. I see it in the human, I don't see it in the animal. So, well, is it true? So, in practice, it does happen that there are animals in whom the psychic spark center has individualized sufficiently to the point where you can actually see it as a early stage of formation of a psychic being and ready for human birth. But before that, you don't see it as psychic being. You just have the psychic spark, which can be supporting everything. And yet that is in a process of graded evolution also, in formation to develop sufficiently the individualization necessary for human birth. So the question need not be so cut and dried if you see this continuity. In the early stages of a series of human reincarnations, during a period of rudimentary humanity, there's a certain possibility at first sight of an often repeated immediate transmigration. The repeated assumption of a new human form in a fresh birth immediately the previous body has been dissolved by the cessation or expulsion of the organized life energy and the consequent physical disintegration, which we call death. Now, you would simply pause and say, why is he using so many words to say when the guy dies, then you take immediate birth? So simple, that's all he's saying. Why all this complication? Dissolve, cessation, expulsion of organized life energy, physical disintegration, which we call death. So this is the way most people tend to read when their mind has not sufficiently matured to appreciate Sri Aurobindo's depth. Let's put it that way. And this is how we see so many people who will read through, and if you say, what did you read? Ah, yes, and the summary idea is there. Good, it's a good start, but it's not anywhere near. Sri Aurobindo never wastes a word. Always remind yourself, and so go deeper. What is he telling you here? So yes, he has said, in an early stage of human evolution, there would have been this immediate rebirth. But what is this transition about? And he's telling you in just a few side attached phrases the nature of this transition of so-called death. Okay, so he's saying this: assumption of a new human form in a fresh birth, immediately that the previous body has been dissolved. Okay, your body has been dissolved. By what? By a cessation or expulsion of the organized life energy and the consequent physical disintegration, which we call death. So now he's telling you the nature of this death. First of all, the biology has upon it imprinted an organized life energy. As long as that organized life energy is embedded in the biology, the physical body does not disintegrate it, it stays alive, it holds the harmony that keeps what we call life going, life processes going. So he's telling you exactly and in rich detail what's really happening in what we call death. So this, the phrase he uses, organized life energy. By its separation, you have the consequence of physical disintegration, which we call death. Again, why does he say which we call death? Why not just say we have physical disintegration, which is death? He says we call it death. So, because the reality is, with the physical disintegration, there is no death still. You are still there. So, we call it death. There's also something else which is implicit in this, that in the physical disintegration itself, not all parts are equally physically disintegrated. So, if you were to actually see the subtle body or even the subtle physical gradations, you would see in some parts enormous disintegration, in other parts there's still bundles still intact. At what point will you say the body died? Now, I'm looking at it not from an occult point of view, which would be one way to look, and Mark describes this in his book, in the book Tempest, when he describes a person who was on the brink of passing on and seeing how the disintegration was taking place. But what is more interesting, from a purely materialist science point of view, there is this recognition now, more and more in the last few years, that different parts of the biology break down at different paces, and some parts can actually stay alive at a cellular level, but in a very different kind of functioning, going several days after technically you say the person has died. This is very disturbing when you think about it seriously. Biologically, the cells are still working. The parts of the brain which are still functioning. What is happening there? Especially for those who think that we are biology and brain, they say, oh, that means a part of us is alive. We're having dreams. Is that what the near-death experience is like? No, but it is true that in the biology, in the places where the life force bundles are still, secondary bundles or tertiary bundles are still held tightly, that breakdown has not yet happened, although the overall functioning of the body has been shut down. So technically you say the person is dead, but the parts of the person in the biology level which are not yet dead and take a few days even to gradually decline. And during that time, there's a total shift in the way they work, in the way the cells process from lack of oxygen, but they still continue to function in a different mode. So the article which I saw, this is barely a few weeks ago, which describes this recent discovery, they are proposing that there is a different state. There is life, there is death, and there's an intermediate, which is neither life nor death, but an intermediate state. And this is what they're trying to understand from purely biological perspective. So even the point of calling this death, he says, we call it death, but actually it's just physical disintegration. You are not dead, but also that disintegration itself is not full death. There could be partial degrees and stages of it. But so remember now, the key point he has shown you is the organized life energy separating. Now, how does it separate? He gives you two words: by a cessation or expulsion of the organized life energy. Remember, your biology is sustained by this organized life energy. In his talk, which Mark gave, I don't know if it's in the book, but in his talk, which he gave this time, he was describing, and it's again, he said it, that he's the only person describing this. And I will vouch for it based on what I have read. Of course, I have not read everything, but I don't find anyone else explaining this. He explains how the subtle body binds to the physical. So let's put it this way. He says there's an energetic system in the biology. There's an energetic system in the subtle body, and the two are an exact mirror of each other and joined together. So as long as they're joined together, sharing that energetic system, you are, so to say, stuck, glued to the physical body. At the time of separation, you find threads linking the two energetic system, and at some point, when the separation is enough, all of these coalesce into a single link, which becomes now what we call the silver cord, linking the two bodies. But in the silver cord, literally from one point in the subtle body, it goes all the way through the silver cord to the equivalent point in the gross body. And the linkage of these two is what he describes. When that separation is complete, the link is cut, then you have technically the death, disintegration, which leads to death. Now, Sri Aurobindo, without going into that kind of technical detail, is telling you essentially this principle, that there is this organized life energy and the joining of it with the biology. When that is separated, there is the consequent physical disintegration, which we call death. What is the separating thing? Cessation or expulsion of the organized life energy. So either it shrinks, weakens until it stops, And now the subtle body and gross body are no more bound. They separate, you drift off. Technically, now you have death. So slow, gradual decay, decline, which is generally what happens in people who live very long. Of course, beyond the point of that decline, it can't sustain and there's a rapid breakdown. This is one, cessation, slowing down and weakening. The other is expulsion. That's interesting. So something coming as a powerful blow or a shock throws it, separates it. That's what we call accident. So through a gradual decay with age or by a sudden shock which throws out this organized life energy. Now, it's not just accident. So why doesn't he simply say accident? No, he's saying something much more deep, of which accident is a special case. So there are other cases, for example, where your body has been infected, let's say, or some poison has been introduced, or infection is poisoning the body. What is the poisoning doing? The poison itself is interfering with this link of life force with physical body and is expelling in parts, bit by bit, the linkage of the life force. So it's not as a sudden accident from outside which breaks and forces it out, but the introduction of this which creates the separation, and it expels the organized life force and leading eventually to disintegration, followed by dissolution and death. If this interference is mild, local, partial, and enough for the body then to be able to remove quickly enough, then you have a temporary separation, a partial separation, which is experienced as a numbing, and a partial separation, which is a state of unconsciousness or sleep-like state. You are then under anesthesia, we say. It's an anesthetic. So the anesthetic is doing that job of separating this in the portions where it comes, but because it moves at slow pace and the body is capable of managing it and starts removing it, you have a temporary expulsion or a partial expulsion. Not everywhere, not in the most significant parts, in the finer parts which are more susceptible, enough to make your body numb and for your mind to be in a state of as if sleep. So you see, the precise use of certain words has got a broad variety of experiences into this description. And now when you reread, you'll appreciate, oh my God, he's put so much knowledge, so much information, so much understanding by using this long sentence structure with many different elements. So I'm going to reread that last portion. The repeated assumption of a new human form in a fresh birth immediately that the previous body has been dissolved by a cessation or expulsion of the organized life energy and the consequent physical disintegration, which we call death. So the moment this happens, okay, you move on and take new birth. Again, if you pause and ask organized life energy, what is this life energy and what does it mean for it to be organized? And this gives you another insight. I'll just touch upon this for now. When you organize something, what do you say? My desk is in chaos. I'm going to organize it. What are you doing? All the key pieces which are already there, you change their relationship with each other. Life energy inherently is not static, it is moving. So when you organize life energy, you're putting it or fragments or tendencies of it in a particular relation, which makes for a certain movement to become repetitive and hold the state of organization. What holds the organization is an imprint of mind and idea holding this together and keeping it in a loop for a particular purpose. So an organized life energy, the organized suggests the mind content holding and the life energy flowing in a certain harmony structure for a particular purpose and outcome. This is organized life energy. Now here you have all the essential ingredients of how the body is kept alive. And it's also at that essential level an understanding of how you can create a new bundle of life-giving or living formation. So in the subtle worlds, in the subtle body, in the vital worlds particularly, you create an organized life energy bundle, And the thing acquires as if a life of its own and continues sustaining. You could take that and infuse it into an object or an animal or a human, and it will do its thing. This is the basis for certain types of mantras when they are used for cure or specific outcomes. The repetition of the mantra with the mind dwelling is the formation of a whirl of energy with a certain intention, and then a release of that to do a specific thing, either to cure, to heal, to help, to harm, to change, whatever it is. You're releasing energy bundles, forms of organized life energy. In a sense, our biology structure is supported by an organized life energy of a much more complex organized structure held in the subtle body and then infused into the gross body. So I'm just showing you how, if you really pause and ask these questions, you'll find there is a really huge amount of content that is held in this very simple sentence. So come back to the text. But what necessity of the evolutionary process would compel such a series of immediate births? Evidently, it could only be an imperative so long as the psychic individuality, not the secret soul entity itself, but the soul formation in the natural being is little evolved, insufficiently developed, so insufficiently formed that it could not abide except by dependence upon the uninterrupted continuance of this life's mental, vital, and physical individuality. So, on that level, when it is so dependent on holding, even to hold an individuality with the biological basis, it would need to keep doing that. Unable as yet to persist in itself, discard its past mind formations and life formations and build upon a useful after a useful interval new formations, it would be obliged to transfer at once its rudimentary crude personality for the preservation to a new body. You form a bundle, you are unable to hold on its own once separate from the biology. So to keep it going, well, plug into the new body as quickly as you can. But if you have been able to build a certain capacity to persist by itself without need for biology form, with the ability to discard portions of past mind formations and life formations, build new formations after a useful interval, then it would not be dependent on such a process. So he's describing this gradation, this transition in the evolution. Now you notice here the entire description of this, which defines the transition from one stage of evolution to another. The entire thing is psychological and not physical biological. Physical biological evolution, as we see with DNA, RNA, epigenetics, and now more and more, even they are discovering protein structures are transmitted in heredity. That's a new discovery. Just a week back, I saw the report about this. So even protein structures of parents are transmitted to the, and it's nothing to do with DNA or even epigenetics. So they're discovering now the reality of the real nature of inheritance. But I'm skipping that. What he's describing is purely psychological, has nothing to do with genetics. So you could have the same genetics of biology of this grade and this grade of consciousness, and you'd have a completely different behavior as if in a new species. This is a significant difference of the ape body and the human body. Yes, there are certain limitations which are there in the genetics, but as they point out, it's less than 1%, I don't remember, 1.4% or less than 1%, whatever it is in the genetics, and that alone cannot explain this huge difference. It is not based on genetics, it's based on the consciousness and the ability of consciousness first to persist in itself, discard certain elements of mind and life formations, build new formations, and so on. And this is the skill of the evolution. This is essentially the first significant step in that spiritual evolution. You see, its measure, its value is entirely independent of the biology. You don't have that when you belong to that lower grade of evolution. You have that, now you're already part of a next grade of evolution, and then perhaps even a higher grade. So he actually speaks in earlier portion, which we did not read, 3 such gradations. One grade where you are compelled to take birth immediately, the other where you can now rest in between and do this reshaping, rearranging of your individuality formations. And a third, where the individuality is now so well formed, you can actually take birth again immediately without much loss. Now, all this is very important because at the end of the chapter, we are going to come to this whole point of how are we to make this transition without losing continuity and yet without compromising the need for reforming our temperament and nature as suited for the new experience. How will that be? You see, here a critical element is the formation of this individuality. And the individuality which can persist without needing a biological container to maintain its separateness and individuality. It is doubtful whether we should be justified in attributing any such entirely insufficient development to a being so strongly individualized that it has got as far as the human consciousness. So if you have got to the human consciousness, then you will not have the tendency to want to be compelled to reincarnate, typically. Even at his lowest normality, the human individual is still a soul, acting through a distinct mental being, however ill-formed his mind may be, however limited and dwarfed, however engrossed and encased in the physical and vital consciousness, and unable or unwilling to detach itself from its lower formations. Again, it's a complex sentence. It's worth it for you to dwell on each of the options he is providing. We won't go into that now. The whole series of cases that he is taking into account and showing you, despite all these variations, it can still be in a human stage of evolution. Yet we may suppose that there is a downward attachment so strong as to compel the being to hasten at once to a resumption of the physical life because his natural formation is not really fit for anything else or at home on any higher plane. So you go out, you feel, oh, I need to get back there because that's familiar. Or again, the life experience might be so brief and incomplete as to compel the soul to an immediate rebirth for its continuance. So this is the case often of short life or accidental deaths. So it's as if what was to be done is not complete, you just take incarnation immediately after. Other needs, influences, or causes there may be in the complex of nature process, such as a strong will of earthly desire pressing for fulfillment, which would enforce an immediate transmigration of the same persistent form of personality into a new body. You see here, this is very interesting. Strong will of earthly desire pressing for fulfillment. You're about to leave the body and say, yes, but I want this. Shup. You rush. But still, the alternative process of a reincarnation, a rebirth of the person, capital P, not only into a new body, but into a new formation of the personality, would be the normal line taken by the psychic entity once it had reached the human stage of its evolutionary cycle. So, at the human level, normally there will be this need to create a new formation of personality and so on. So, now comes something very important. For the soul personality, as it develops, must get sufficient power over its own nature formation and a sufficient self-expressive mental and vital individuality to persist without the support of the material body, as well as to overcome any excessive detaining attachment to the physical plane and the physical life. It would be sufficiently evolved to subsist in the subtle body, which we know to be the characteristic case or sheath and the proper subtle physical support of the inner being. So, as you evolve, you have to get sufficient power over your own ability to hold your nature, your formation, your power of expressive mind, vital individuality without needing a physical biology. You have to develop that. It's a necessary part of your evolution, of your spiritual evolution. Not only you have to develop this ability to hold your formation of individuality separate from biology, but it's a vital individuality, expressive, sufficiently self-expressive mental individuality, its own sense of nature form, you have to be able to hold. And second, you have to overcome excessive attachment to physical plane and physical life, which is also part of the habit of that nature. You have to sufficiently evolve to be able to live in your subtle body in the subtle physical sheath, which is the true support for the inner being. You have to get to that. And in a sense, again, this becomes a determining factor of your current state of evolution. Remember, again, we are looking at evolutionary terms in a mechanistic sense, but not biologically based. They're still mechanistic. You're defining in very clear terms what is it. It's not like, oh, now I'm come to vital consciousness, now I'm come to mental consciousness, now I've gone to spiritual. No, it's about formation of individuality, the ability to hold, express, shape yourself, modify yourself, and hold that individuality in this distinct form. Why is this important? Because this culminates, or this builds the basis for the spiritual evolution, but this culminates also in the ability then to take, in the third stage, rebirth, if you choose to, immediately, without losing any sense of continuity. So it's as if a culmination of this process of the true formation of individuality. But in this, retaining even expressive mental powers and vital individuality, persisting without support of the physical body. So now think of it this way. Earlier, the dependence on the physical body was because it was a very early stage of evolution, let's say in the animal stage, where the physical body, by encasing, provides the sense of individuality, narrow, bound, limited, and I am separate from everything else. That it needed the biology. You come out, you seem to as if lose everything. You plug in, now again I'm individual. Now I lose individuality. Oh, I plug in. Now you evolve sufficiently to the human stage where you come out. Oh, I can stay. I'm conscious. And I don't need biology. I can stay individualized, even if the mind is not very developed. So he should remember earlier what he described, all the different variations. Despite all of that, you can still be in the human, but it would be a very poorly developed human so far. It is the soul person, the psychic being that survives and carries mind and life with it on its journey. And it is in the subtle body that it passes out of its material lodging. So you go out into this, you are, and that's you. The body is not you. The body is the sheath that you took on. But then must be sufficiently, both then must be sufficiently developed for the transit. So mind, life force, held in the subtle body, must be sufficiently developed so that you can make this transit and even wander around consciously and explore the worlds, etc. But a transference of to planes of mind existence or life existence implies also a mind and life sufficiently formed and developed to pass without disintegration and exist for a time on these higher levels. So what happens when you leave the biology? Will your mind and vital simply disintegrate because there is no sufficient individualization? Can they stay on their own? Again, it's a mechanistic description of a measure of your evolution that you can hold that in the vital, in the mental, without disintegrating and exist for a time on these higher levels. Then only you can actually explore and experience these planes. If these conditions were satisfied, a sufficiently developed psychic personality and subtle body, and a sufficiently developed mental and vital personality, survival of the soul person without an immediate new birth would be secured. And the pull of the other worlds would become imperative. So if you've come to this point of evolution, you are now capable of surviving as in the subtle body, and automatically you get pulled into those worlds. You can't immediately rush to incarnate. You come out, you are individualized, you are pulled immediately. So he is now straight away divided evolution of consciousness into two gradations. One where you're not yet formed enough to be able to stay like this, and one where you're formed. When you're not enough formed, you will tend to incarnate as quickly as possible, binding to whatever is most easily available in terms of material quality of your consciousness. The other, you will tend inevitably to wander off unless you applied a very conscious, strong will. You will wander into those worlds. But this by itself would mean a return to Earth with the same mental and vital personality, and there would be no free evolution in the new birth. There must be an individuation of the psychic person itself sufficient for it not to depend on its past mind and life formations any more than on its past body, but to shed them too in time and proceed to a new formation for new experience. So here comes a further necessity. You can't keep the same mind vital formations. You want different variations. So for that, your psychic person has to be sufficiently individualized. So consider that through all this, much of that may not yet have happened. So you get another stage of development, again described in a very mechanistic sense, but of the subtle substance and gradations. And the psychic individuality has to be sufficient that you can actually shed the mind and vital layers and still hold yourself. You see how this is a direct measure of steps of evolution. It's also what makes possible for you to become conscious in those planes and stay and even experience and retain memory as you come back. This individualization is so critical. It is key to everything in the spiritual journey. If you do not have a sufficiently individualized, psychic personality, mind personality, vital personality, you are basically still struggling with being able to do some very basic things. How much of your life was consciously meant or used for this purpose? Think about it. Very little, if at all. So you should be able to, in time, shed this, at least the coarser elements of your vital personality and mental personality, and the psychic person remains individualized enough. 4. This discarding of the old and preparation of new forms. For this discarding of the old and preparation of new forms, the soul must dwell for some time between two births, somewhere else than on the entirely material plane in which we now move. For here there would be no abiding place for a disembodied spirit. A brief stay might indeed be possible if there are subtle envelopes of the earth existence which belong to earth, but are of vital and mental character. But even then, there would be no reason for the soul to linger there for a long period unless it is still burdened with an overpowering attachment to the earth life. Okay, so again, one of those sentences where in just a few strokes, he has outlined a huge variety of possibilities, but with the rationality of understanding why and how. So let's say you have now come into this out of the physical body, you've shed the body. The process of shedding the vital, shedding the mental, requires you to stay in some other plane, not physically. So somewhere else than on the entirely material plane in which we now move. What's the problem with the material plane? There's no place for you to be able to stay there in terms of quality of consciousness as a natural support. You'll tend to get pulled into some other grade, which is your natural state first. But he says, a brief stay would be possible, very close to the material plane, as a disembodied spirit, if there are subtle envelopes of the earth existence which belong to earth but are of vital and mental character. So this is very interesting. The vital plane, vital substance has gradations leaning towards matter. And so there is, the correct term would be physical vital. Okay. So vital of the grade of physicality approaching. Similarly, physical mental approaching. Nearly of a physical density, but of mental grade of substance. But because it is of close to the earth, belonging to the vital or mental character, you find yourself in the subtle body close to the earth zone, while still in the vital and mental bodies. Interesting. So either this, even there's no reason for you to linger for a long period, because what's the point? Nothing changes. You want to work to replace this, change these gradations. Why would you want to stay? Unless, so one more exception, it is still burdened with an overpowering attachment to the earth life. The mind is obsessed, the vital is obsessed with something which it has left behind is concerned about. So having shed the body, you have this, you're close enough. You don't need to stay long unless something in you says this. This is the reason why in all the religious traditions they will say, okay, before you quit, get rid of all those things which would bind you. And in cases where this happens, people can hang around pretty long. So I think in the first book of Mark, he mentions somebody who had committed suicide and was still hanging around after 20 years. And the moment, it was a lady, and the moment she detected that he could sense her, she began to talk to him and demand help to get free. And so eventually he helped the family to do a small ritual to tell her, okay, now finished, now you go, please, you're free to go. And after that, there was a distinct shift and she had gone. But this is an example. 20 years is quite a long time in earth terms. But why? The person was obsessed with something, bothered with something, and had to be told, look, it's no more your concern now. You need to move on. You need to let go. Now think about how many times on earth, in earth life, we have faced such difficulties. We don't want to let go of something, and then somehow we're taught to let go. Again and again and again and again. That's your training ground. So when you finally leave for the body, you say, now I have been trained well enough. Now I know to let go and to move on. But if you have not, and if there is something, especially when there's cases of accident, and in that case, suicide, where there was an obsession with something, the person is stuck. And that's when these rituals or methods of communicating could be of relevance. But again, for a spiritual person who has prepared himself, herself for this, it's not a problem. So I complete the paragraph. This overpowering attachment to the earth life is what would bind. A survival of the material body by the personality implies a supra-physical existence. And this can only be in some plane of being proper to the evolutionary stage of the consciousness. If the he's saying is, if the personality has to survive the material body, it can only be in a supra-physical existence and a plane which is proper to your current evolutionary stage. Or if there is no evolution, in a temporary second home of the spirit, which would be its natural place of sojourn between life and life. Unless indeed it is its original world from which it does not return into material nature. So he's actually arguing out various different positions on this. Where then would the temporary dwelling in the supraphysical take place? What would be the soul's other habitat? So having taken all the different theories of what should happen now, see, step by step, he's taking all the different belief systems, religious systems, arguments, philosophical arguments, and resolving them by going into the root principles, logically explaining what happens. But behind it all, the common thread is spiritual evolution. Remove spiritual evolution and all this becomes purposeless, pointless, unnecessary. Bring back spiritual evolution and it is compelled that it must be like this or like that or like that in this way or other. And these would be natural stages. And with these natural stages, this would be the possibilities inevitably. The whole thing becomes clear, simple, logically stated. So where is this temporary dwelling? What will be the soul's other habitat, if there is such a thing? And is it mental plane, mental worlds, etc.? So now he goes into that's another paragraph. Maybe we will look at next time. But a couple of questions which we will keep for later. Then we'll use this as a point of pause. I'm going to quickly look at the chat box. So Tuton is asking, I have taken my son's fever upon myself when he was small. Yes, almost every mother, sometimes even the father, would do that. And it's so natural and spontaneous. You don't know how you do it, but you just take it and it happens. It's actually as simple as that. Sue is saying, can one choose to wait and reincarnate only when Earth is more ready for divine manifestation? In principle, you could, but then you would have missed the bus. So Earth is ready for divine manifestation. You are not yet capable of it. You missed the chance when Earth was going through the gradations that you need to pass before Earth could get to that which you need to get also to. You understand? The trick is to flow with the Earth's natural rhythm of progression. That's, let's say, the large mass of humanity pushed by slow evolution. You choose now to accelerate. Yes, of course, there are difficulties. But you are then ready for and can already begin to participate in that higher life before the rest of the earth is ready. So why wait for the whole earth to be ready? Why not just you start incarnating already something higher and truer, which will help earth get overall earth to get ready? That's what we are here for. That's our priority as conscious spiritual beings. You don't want to wait. You want yourself to build the capacity so that you can start incarnating well before and thereby assist the larger collective consciousness of earth to be ready, isn't it? If Sri Aurobindo and the mother had not done what they did in terms of embodying, incarnating the higher spiritual consciousness, we would not be able to do anything of what we're doing today. Because they did that and imprinted it, today we are able to do so much more. In the same way, when you accelerate and move forward as completely as you can, because you're ready for it, why would you wait and lose time? You do what you have to do, you will find that it will help others. Who helped will then be able to help more others. And then there is this avalanche effect, so to say. Yes. But in principle, yes, you can. You can choose to wait. Sagar is asking, will evolution end with the manifestation of supramental consciousness, or is it never going to stop? It's all this comes from a wrong understanding of supramental consciousness. The supramental consciousness being the consciousness which unifies all. It also is the consciousness where you have full access to all potential. You are no more bound from that point on in any kind of ignorance. But all potential is still waiting to express itself. So you have now the power to develop that all potential without the burden of ignorance. And as you develop that all potential is the further stage of the evolution unendingly, but without the burden of ignorance. So if you look at it this way, the big picture of evolution has two phases. The first, where you're struggling to emerge from ignorance, reaching a point where now you're fundamentally free of that ignorance, or essentially, and from there now to build on that freedom with the fullness of what is further possible. And that would be the nature of the supramental evolution. So we can map it this way vertically, or the mother maps it the other way. She says, you rise to the supramental consciousness. From there, as if evolution reverses itself, and now it's a movement of manifesting new possibilities with unending, infinite possibilities of powers of bliss and consciousness and potentials of various kinds. So yes, evolution does not end, but it changes mode dramatically. Revati is asking about this people describing a tunnel and white light full of love in the near-death experience. This is a very specific formation which did not exist in the past, and it was built a little over 100 years ago by the mother in the period, I believe, 1903 to 4. As part of her mission in this life, she built this link of a tunnel, which anybody who has some spiritual opening and aspiration will find helped to make a direct passage through the dangerous passages of the lower vital and other worlds, straight into the psychic and spiritual domain, which is full of light. And there's a being, again, created by her, who is like the guardian, whose task it is to help people make this transition. So all these experiences of the tunnel, white light, and being of love are post 1903 or 4, when Mother created this. That's why all the prior texts described hells and heavens, through which you have to pass before you get to some degree of freedom in the higher worlds. Subsequent to that, you can entirely bypass all those confusing and difficult transitions simply by remembering and calling for the help, and be helped by this being. And it's a being of incredible love. When you read those descriptions, so beautiful, that divine being takes you across straight through the passage. You don't have any exposure to those disturbing words, and you're straight away in the domain of the light. And from there, you can withdraw into the psychic rest or otherwise. Anupam is saying that marijuana and bhang are not nothing to do with spirituality, but yet both are associated with Shiva and taken as a consecrated prasad. Can you clarify? So yes, it is associated, but in very low grade practices. This is one of the special features of India, where every possibility was taken and turned towards the spiritual. So for those who need it, and their consciousness is so embedded in coarsened states that you get this kick which opens you to something freer, wider, and yeah, why not? For that purpose, it is useful, and you do it in the name of God, remembering God. So you drink alcohol, taking the name of Shiva, and your consciousness turns in the inebriated state to something higher. Well, for those who need the inebriation, yes, that's a good thing. But if you don't need the inebriation, do not go into that saying, oh, this is a way of worshipping Shiva. No, it's not. It is a lower way for those who are bound in the lower animal nature. That's why even in the left-hand path, which does these practices of the Tantra, they describe human beings in terms of the animal humans, the ordinary humans, and then the divine humans. And according to each, there is a different path. So if you are reasonably sattvic, you don't have to engage with all that, and you can directly open to the higher possibilities. SRJMD is saying, is surrogate birthing such a negative idea? As populations decline, science will try different ways for human birthing. Wouldn't be surprised if non-human wombs are created by science. Yes, actually, those things have been experimented with, and they've actually done that with animals also up to a certain point. But the question is this: what is the effect that has on the person so born? Yes, let's say you grow up in an artificial mechanical womb. Your biology is formed. If you were only biology, it wouldn't matter. But since you're not only biology, your soul with mind, vital, physical, subtle physical, and the need for the love and nourishment that it brings to you, which shapes and forms your entire personality by this overflowing love. Where would you get that in the mechanical womb? And you would come out of that womb a damaged person, psychologically, having not experienced that, having no sense of that, perhaps being numb to that. And it would be measurable on the biological level in terms of receptors of various kinds of sensitivities. So there are experiments and of this kind. One has to follow up to see how it affects the psychology. Look at what it gives and what it does not give, and there you'll have the obvious answer. But your argument that population declining requires you to have such methods is wrong. Why is population declining? And a lot of this has to do with the pesticides and the poisons in the food, and the hormonal imbalances it is created, and something of the Asuric programming. All these are combining to reduce the fertility of the human species or to create damage to the normal instincts of humanity and so on. So the correction will not be by artificial corrections, but by purifying once again our lifestyles, bringing back fresh air, fresh water, fresh food, which is not damaged genetically and which is not poisoned with pesticides and other chemicals. And automatically your biology will bounce back in good health and with all its right instincts to be able to fulfill nature's natural drives, and it will take care of itself. So again, weren't Mother and Sri Aurobindo open to science and technology? Yes, of course. But my point is, yes, this is a technology you can play with. But if it is superior to a normal human birth, you would say, yes, it's worth doing. But if as by technology you're doing something which is inferior, it doesn't make sense. So by technology, we will repeat, replicate, imitate what nature has already done much better. And in that way, we can, having mastered the technology, do things which nature has not done. Useful for exploration, but always ask to what end. When we create new materials, for example, with nanotechnology, materials which don't naturally exist in nature, but having mastered nature's processes, and we see even in a butterfly's color, there is nanotechnology. In the brain's cellular working, there are quantum effects. You observe those, you replicate those, make them with different materials, and now you can as if amplify, modify, build new qualities. That's useful. But if you're taking already a very sophisticated structure building a crude, coarsened, even damaging version of it, it's not, it's useful just as a development of technology, but not useful for application. That's all I'm saying. Yeah, and yes, certainly we should have mastery over everything. So, okay, I will skip that portion of the discussion. SU is saying, some mediums are claiming that humanity will be given a choice to choose between rising spirituality or becoming more materialistic. And the date given is whatever, 21st March. No, there's no such date. The choice has always been there for millions of years, and it will always be. There's no fixed date. All this is, mediums are fundamentally flawed in that their source of knowledge is coming from lower vital entities. And the lower vital entities are primarily interested in fooling around with human beings, to fool them, to feed on them, to divert them, and to play with them. And they'll always feed you things which will create for you wrong ideas and take you off track. So best is to avoid reading anything which has to do with mediums. Look at the principle. The choice was always there. The choice will always be there. The question is, will you take it now? Or will you wait for some other date? So, okay, I think we'll pause on these two ideas. We have right now the choice, every day, every moment, whether we will choose to rise spiritually or sink back into a lower grade of consciousness. When we rise spiritually, there will be degrees of individualization of our consciousness. And today, at least, we'll focus on this. For which purpose? Your life is giving you that capacity to individualize your vital being, vital nature, capacity to individualize and organize your mental nature. And within it all, the capacity to individualize and become more conscious and able to maintain individuality at the psychic center as a psychic, conscious psychic being. These three are our priority. To the extent that these three grow, it's a measure even of our spiritual evolution. We're not yet speaking of higher levels of consciousness, but if you have not built these, your access to higher levels of consciousness would not be easy or natural or sustainable. You'd find yourself overwhelmed and then you'll drop right back. But when you're sufficiently individualized in all three, you'll find yourself able to access, stay, develop, build, and integrate those higher levels into these. And that's when a different phase of the spiritual journey would begin. So, recognizing the value of this individualization, what does it mean? Without the biology, which binds you in a narrow desire and separated sense of identity, to be able to be conscious as a mind, as a life being, and as a psychic presence, independent of all external circumstances. And the sense of that is simply, you are this irrespective of what happens externally. So it's a poise, one could say, of, as if taking a status of the witness, separating from everything and holding your poise, not being shaken and moved by those changing circumstances, and holding yourself. Such would be a very basic practice, for example. To live more and more from there, from the freedom that such a poise offers, initially with mind, then with the vital, which may be a little more difficult for many. And then as you become conscious of the psychic presence, centered within it, and from there engaging with life, not affected, not moved, not disturbed by the disturbances externally. This is the basic training by which you will be accelerating this process of the spiritual individualization. And challenges and circumstances for developing this are around us every day. So let's take this as one of the most significant efforts we will make for the immediate few days at least, and understanding its value for the spiritual evolution. In this, the natural poise for the psychic center, for the psychic being, is not just to have this individualized poise, but also from there to lean back to its right relation with the universe and with the world and with the divine, because it is a part of the divine consciousness. So the right relation is to experience itself as a child of the Divine Mother. But here, as a conscious, immortal part of her put out for the experience and for the expression of her will in life. So such would be the deeper spiritual alignment to the individualization of the psychic being. If this we can hold even as an idea in the mind and perhaps in the heart as a sense of purpose, then it aligns the mind and the vital to the psychic to some degree. And by this constant stress of aspiration to hold, feel this, and to align to this, the process of deepening and integration would begin to take place naturally. So dwell on this, remember it every morning if you can, and again remind yourself every evening before sleeping. You are a child of the Divine Mother, put out by her for this work to fulfill her will in the world. Your mind, your vital are instruments to be organized, to be made effective as focal points for the action, but always aligned to this which opens to her. And such would be the state that you hold in yourself, maybe before you go to sleep or before you start your day in the morning. Let's concentrate in this for a while. Namaste.
Namaste. Thank you.